You're listening to the Curio-city Collective podcast, and I'm Deepika. Today, we're going to continue our conversation on connection and care and what that means while we're living in the time of a global pandemic. And for this conversation, I'm happy to introduce one of the co-founders of the Curio-city Collective, Srinidhi Raghavan. She'll be talking about her own experience of care and learning to receive care, and the possibilities and potential it holds for all of us as we inhabit our communities.
When we began talking about care and connection in the times of COVID-19, I began to think about my own relationship with caregiving and care receiving. It has evolved so much over the years. I've grown to see how revolutionary care really is. This quote by Joanna Hedway, an activist and the person who wrote Sick Movement Theory, speaks to this.
What we're watching happen with COVID-19 is what happens when care insists on itself. When the care of others becomes mandatory, when it takes up space and money and labor and energy. See how hard it is to do? The world isn't built to give care freely and abundantly. It's trying now. But look how alien a concept this is. How hard it is to make happen. It will take all of us. It will take all of us operating on the principle that if only some of us are well, none of us are. And that's exactly why it's revolutionary. Because care demands that we live as though we are all interconnected, which we are. It invalidates the myth of the individual's autonomy. In care, we know our limits because they are the places where we meet each other. My limit is where you meet me. Yours is where I find you. And at this meeting place, we are linked, made of the same stuff, transforming into one because of the other.
In our minds, an ill person, a disabled person, a disabling condition, all have caveats and imagery attached. I somehow didn't fit any of these, despite the fact that I've lived with chronic pain for 5 years now. Calling attention to the fact that I'm in pain and need some help is one of the hardest things I have to do, especially in the face of everybody's shock, disbelief, and the oh so common, oh, you don't look sick. So very early on, I got good at pretending I was fine. And by making myself more invisible, this meant I struggled to tell people at work, at home, friends, acquaintances, everybody, how ill I actually was. I didn't go out much and often had to cancel plans last minute because my body couldn't be bothered to match my calendar. The migraines would come if they wanted to come. The pain would peak if the pain would peak. So this resulted in me living a very isolated life. Eventually, all my non-disabled friends were confused by the number of events I had to miss or the naps I was forced to take because of the consistent exhaustion of just living day to day. Feeling isolated, I looked around for resonance. That's when I found chronically ill Twitter and disabled literature. Oh, what a saving grace. The literature is full of people talking about the social isolation and how hard it is for people to not understand our lived experiences. But what it also did for me was it redefined care. This is how my close social circle of friends from Instagram and Twitter became my in real life friends. Being away from them is not particularly new for me, and being ill has meant a different relationship to social isolation. This group of friends of mine, we go months without seeing each other. Sometimes weeks go by and I haven't heard from them, especially when they are too ill to look at their phone. This is just accepted. It isn't taking each other for granted, but in many ways it was us learning to renegotiate this immediacy of care and connection that the internet had reinforced for us. This is not to say that they didn't show up for me. In fact, without doubt, every few months, I would receive a package in the mail. Some bath salts, some vitamins, some tea, a calming book, something to help the pain, but mostly something to help me get by. Small acts of care. Acts that said, I've been thinking of you. On my fridge, there are notes of care from this group of people. They act as reminders. We had taught ourselves how to care for each other when our bodies and minds needed more rest than what was acceptable in society. We had built a small circle of ways in which we reached out to support each other through life's ups and downs and uncertainties. Through these acts of care and through listening to each other's lived experiences, I found myself redefining how I understood care. So, when we began to talk about social distancing because of the coronavirus, it felt all right to me. Given that I've spent many of the past years alone, I felt I understood social distancing and the anxiety of all this uncertainty. In a piece titled Chronic Uncertainty, S01E08, a writer and disabled woman, talks about how her chronic illness had prepared her for the uncertainty that we find ourselves in a COVID-19 world. She says,
As COVID-19 engulfs the news, the world is poised in a moment of uncertainty, the exact likes of which we haven't seen before. Responses vary. I continue to half joke about the apocalypse because I watched Armageddon and Deep Impact in 1998, and both made a mark on me deeper than the Aerosmith song that accompanied the former. Plenty of people are drinking. Others are working to maintain their sobriety, boasting about virtual AA meetings and volunteering to speak on the phone with anyone who might fall off the wagon. One of my dear friends tells me that she is 100% experiencing the Melancholia Effect, by which she means that after a lengthy bout of depression, she is now so even-keeled, it is almost eerie.
I related to what Esme was saying. The uncertainty of waking up in the morning and knowing if I can cook myself a meal today had prepared me for the uncertainty of when the lockdown would end. But I began to notice things that were troublesome even for me. These past few weeks of social distancing and lockdown, I haven't been able to send any of my friends their care packages, since everything non-essential is shut right now. We've had to renegotiate our ways of care for each other. I want them to know, despite these tough times, that I think of them and I care about them. How then can we re-establish new ways that retain the intimacy and thoughtfulness of the previous ways? Is care in many ways then showing up for each other with empathy, with love and affection, in the ways that the person needed and not in the ways we are accustomed to doing? A lot of discussion on social media has been challenging that care cannot be an individual-driven practice, but we must insist on caring for each other, especially in times like now. If our neighbors are sick, the chances of us getting sick are higher. So caring for each other then becomes an essential part of our survival. So much of disability literature is about interdependence. Disability justice activist Mia Mingus says,
Interdependency is both you and I, and we. It is solidarity in the best sense of the word. It is inscribing community on our skin over and over and over again. It is truly moving together in an oppressive world towards liberation and refusing to let the personal be a scapegoat for the political. It is knowing that one organization, one student or community group is not a movement. It is working in coalition and collaboration. Because the truth is, we need each other. We need each other. And every time we turn away from each other, we turn away from ourselves. We know this. Let us not go around, but instead, courageously through.
care isn't always so simple. As we have seen in the way people have responded to the pandemics of the past, the many inequalities in society are heightened. We live in a world that is designed to provide care for some people and withdraw it from others. One of the largest critiques of the self-care model has been that self-care has been transformed to be a way through which we can rest, take care of ourselves, and then return to the workforce to better contribute in it. But for me, only after I became disabled did I realize that I needed to challenge this myth of independence and the idea that self-care is individualistic. Much of the disabled community has been talking about this for decades. You know, that automatic door opening and closing that happens in malls and public offices, etc. The disabled community had to fight very hard for it. It was actually introduced into the world as an accessibility measure. so people on wheelchairs and crutches could enter and exit buildings with ease. This measure was hard fought for. And right now, it is a huge boon to society, especially since we don't want to touch any surfaces in times of corona. So, door opening by itself is just fantastic. Yet, world over, we are making lists of who must receive care. And the disabled, old, and sick people don't make that list. It's also important to see who then we care about and whose right to care we fight for. Figuring out ways where we can care for each other, where mutual aid is possible, is something this pandemic is demanding out of us. Rebel Sydney Black, a transformative justice activist, explores this idea of pod mapping, especially in times of crisis and in this pandemic. That's something that we all share right now. She enters this through the conversation of mutual aid. She says that mutual aid can happen between 2, 20, or thousands of people. And the good place to start is with your people. Whether it's one of your best friends, some people from church, or the handful of acquaintances who live in your building. It's important to assess who would show up for you in a crisis or emergency and who you do the same for. This is where pod mapping comes in. Originally, pod mapping was developed by Mia Mingus for the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective. It was a tool specifically used for accountability and dealing with harm in communities. However, it has been adapted over the years for many different things, especially to see who you can rely on when you're in trouble, or who you turn to for support and who would turn to you. These groups may or may not overlap. You may also have different pods for different situations. A pod is like a microcosm of the community since it's more concrete and it's easier to get organized, to connect, to make a plan, to follow through, and to figure out who would be part of this. Everybody who builds their pod has certain ideas for how their pod would look like. Maybe the people in your pod are reliable, maybe well resourced, maybe they're generous, maybe they're kind. Maybe they have certain skills that you need but don't have. Maybe they just live nearby. How then can we build a pod specific to us that not only focuses on caregiving but also care receiving? For instance, I was in a moment of complete panic the other day because I had run out of cat food. And as everybody knows, you're not finding anything in these times. One of my pod people messaged to check on me. And she remembered that I could visit online fish delivery stores. As not much of a meat eater, it never really struck me to look for delivery options for fresh meat and fish. But her ability to provide me a simple, elegant solution reminds me why she's part of my board. Communities of care do exist all around us. In this video, UN Women shares some of the research and consequences of unpaid care work across the globe.
One kind of universal fact seems to be that in nearly all human societies, it is often upon women this kind of work falls. What we say, it's highly feminized. We have some data which showed that something like 75% of all unpaid care work is carried out by women and girls. So this is a very unequal distribution between men and women. In fact, it does penalize women because taking on the bulk of this work often carries a penalty in terms of not being able to have a full-time job with a decent wage, not being able to accumulate a pension, not getting all of the benefits that come from formal sector employment. So the penalties are many, even though the benefits to society are huge. Redistributing care is really, really critical. So that really involves a rethinking and redoing of our kind of social relationship.
Aside from the research, we also have enough disabled wisdom in the world about caring for each other and interdependence. How then can we use all this wisdom, everything we have learned from the past, in this moment of our lives? Every time we think about care and community, especially in times like now, I'm thinking of all the stories of care that have come up during this pandemic. So while we acknowledge that communities of care that nourished us have existed and still exist, we need to question, who do we leave out of our care webs? Is it the domestic worker? Is it the homeless person, the immigrant with no citizenship and living in camps? But in a time where care is insisting on itself, caring across self-evident communities and across community tensions is seen by individuals, We are witness to a lot of responses which use the internet to bridge the gap of resources in our physical world. Sourcing money for daily wage workers, feeding the elderly, ensuring that everybody has groceries, buying groceries for our neighbors. We're also seeing many communities respond by cooking meals for each other and ensuring people don't starve.
While social distancing is at its peak during the lockdown, this Gurudwara in Bangalore is continuing its tradition. The people here are distributing food packets to the needy as a part of community service.
Myself, Mohinderjeet Singh, representing United States, Bangalore. This seva is being done jointly with Al-Sur Gurudwara Committee, and we visited the Joint Commissioner 2 days back, and he's given us a permission to distribute langar to the needy people here in Bangalore.
With senior citizens, some of the most vulnerable and anxious sections across the country, an NGO in Mumbai is setting a beautiful example. Selfless Samaritans have taken it upon themselves to supply food to senior citizens living alone. NGO called Roundtable India has organized 200 volunteers to target different parts of Mumbai. Using social media, they are pinpointing apartment complexes and getting food delivered to senior citizens living alone there.
These stories of people caring for each other in the physical world, bridging the gaps that the governments are not able to fill by making the extra effort to be there for our fellow citizens, is amazing indeed. It reminds me of how communities of care are possible and that are present in our lives. It's just about sustaining them and continuing to work on them. I would like to close with a quote from Johanna.
Care so often feels as though it has to be given to you by someone else. And this can also seem how revolution feels. We wait for the change to be given to us by those in control. We hope for those in power to come to their senses. So many activists know that as power can be taken, it can be taken back. As care can be given, we can also take it. I've always found solace in the fact that the words caregiver and caretaker mean the same thing. We take care, we give care, and it can be contagious. It can spread. It shows us that the limit of the world is always a place to be exploded, pushed against, transformed. Meet me there at the end, where there is give and take, and let's follow each other into the beginning. If you found this episode interesting, please do share it with your friends, family, and networks. Also join us in our social media spaces, where we'll be talking more about pod mapping and how to build our own pods. We would love to hear your thoughts and ideas on the subject. For all this and more, reach us at www.thecuriositycollective.org.